Welcome to Conversations on the Coast, the Bay Area's premier author interview program. Our guest today is a very experienced and productive writer by the name of Geoffrey Wolff, and his new book is called The Hard Way Around, The Passages of Joshua Slocum. Now, you're an acclaimed, it says here, novelist, essayist, biographer, and critic, and all those kinds of things. Well, what I'm really interested in is, among your nonfiction books, Black Sun, about the short-lived avant-garde poet Harry Crosby, The Art of Burning Bridges, A Life of John O'Hara, which is a literary biography, it says here, The Duke of Deception, which is your memoir.
Yes.
Now, how in the name of hell did you come up with Joshua Slocum, the 19th century mariner, I would call him?
I was given him to read 50 years ago, and I, like most people who read Sailing Alone Around the World for the first time, I was just knocked out by it. And it's one of the few books that I kept coming back to every 5 years or so. When I decided to write about him was after having written about a series of characters, not only in the biographies you mentioned, but in a couple of novels, that I wanted to get out of my house by the time I'd finished, before I'd finished writing about them, even though I have to admit they hadn't invited themselves in there to begin with, but still, I wanted finally to write a book about somebody I just really, really wanted to hang out with.
Okay.
And that's what I did, and that's why.
Well, two reasons you would want to hang out with him. One, he is or was also a writer, and he's a man of the sea, a man of the ocean, and you live up in Maine and probably have a little experience.
I at considerable pains in the book not to even mention that I've ever been in a boat, even in a bathtub, because what I do as a sailor, we've had boats for about 40 years, cruised a lot on them, but it is the only thing I have in common with Slocum is we're both human beings, and well, I might add that I can sort of swim, and he couldn't.
That's
swim.
right. That's right. And you could probably both say welcome aboard.
We can say welcome aboard, although I don't think he said welcome with much feeling. No.
Or to too many people.
Or to too many people. His course through things from the time he went to sea when he was 16.
With only a third-grade education.
With a third-grade education, which he translated into, at the age of 17, he was a ship's officer, second mate. A year later, he was a first mate, and 2 years after that, he was master of his own vessel. So, first of all, he could read, and he did read avidly. But the other thing was he was the probably the most brilliant navigator of his time. He was a lunar navigator.
And you find two parts to that brilliance. One was his learning, his I guess his mathematical skills.
Yes. And
then the other thing you talk about is that he was intuitive about navigation.
He was oddly intuitive. I mean, there's a kind of navigation that all sailors use, which is called dead reckoning, which is calculating, particularly I think challenging in San Francisco Bay, because of the current sets and so forth. But you estimate your position based on what you think to be your speed and your set, whether the current is pushing you one way or another. He was clearly he had hunches about what was happening to him on the surface of the water where he was, but those hunches he never trusted. he confirmed them always with these lunar readings that usually took 3 people to do, and he did it himself. You had to know trigonometry to do it, and he once sailed 5,500 miles from the island of Juan Fernandez all the way to the Marquesas, 43 days, and hit the Marquesas right on the button. They were right in front of him where they were supposed to be.
Wow.
Yeah.
The time at which he was being a great sailor was at the end of the big sail clipper ships. You quote Joseph Conrad. The last days of sailing ships were short, if one thinks of the countless ages since the first sail, or rudely woven rushes was displayed to the wind, stretching the period both ways to the utmost. It lasted from 1850 to 1910, just 60 years. Which is, you think they were there for longer. 2 generations, the winking of an eye, hardly the time to drop a prophetic tear. For the pathos of that era lies in the fact that when the sailing ships and the art of sailing them reached their perfection, they were already doomed. It was a swift doom, but it is consoling to know that there was no decadence.
That's very accurate as far as it goes, and poetic even further. But it's not true that there was no decadence. I mean, the decadence is of every kind. Economic decadence, certainly. The brutality of shipmasters, the brutality of ships' crews. San Francisco was the ground zero for what we're talking about. Crimps, buckets of blood. Captains paid huge rewards at the time of the gold rush.
And then there were these people called crimps.
Certainly were.
Grabbing people off the streets. Well, The Hard Way Around is a book you must like. If not, you ought to be drowned at once. What? Stay tuned.
You're listening to Conversations on the Coast with Jim Foster. Follow us on Twitter at Jim Foster COC or send an email to jimfostercoc@gmail.com.
The Hard Way Around, The Passages of Joshua Slocum by Geoffrey Slocum? By Geoffrey Wolff. Can't read my own. And incidentally, this is published by Alfred A. Knopf, a publisher whom I love to mention because I like to say Knopf. To let you know I can do it. Now, in the New York Times book review recently, a gentleman who's been on my program a couple of times, Nathaniel Felbrick, was the reviewer. And he had some very interesting things to say, like complimentary things like, The Hard Way Around is the best of books, a literary biography that happens also to be an adventure story. And as it turns out, Slocum's backstory is just as enthralling, if not more so, blah, blah, blah. Now we get to the difficult part. I've never heard this about a book before, and it has me nervous. He says, going on, Wolff does not fall victim to the modern obsession with having to find a new, never-before-glimpsed scrap of useless information about a time-worn topic. It sounds to me like Mr. Philbrick's talking about what you can do with a computer research, and then you put it right in the book, and whether it's significant or not, without judgment. I think that's what he's talking about there. And he is content and self-confident enough to provide his own view of the existing record instead of being intimidated by the many researchers and writers who have come before him in the search for Slocum. He embraces their labors. So that's something that people should know. There have been many books on Mr. Slocum. He even concludes with a passage from another author. After finishing this little book, which I did not want to end, I decided, and here's the biggie, it was worthy of the admonition the British children's writer Arthur Ransome directed toward prospective readers of Slocum's narrative. Those who do not like this book ought to be drowned at once. You can't get a higher recommendation than that, I guess. And then our friend concludes with some other nice things that I won't go into. But that's it. People have to get this book under threat of death. And I might say immediate death.
Immediate death. Thank God I have it, and I've also committed that admonition to memory. I have only read the review about 12 times a day since it came out.
Well, of course you would. It's time now, I think, to turn to an absolutely amazing person. His first wife, Virginia Albertina Walker. Talk about her.
She was amazing. They met in Sydney, Australia. He had become an American citizen here in San Francisco.
His roots are in Nova
yeah, he was from Nova Scotia.
Nova Scotia.
Yeah, but he became an American citizen, and his first big command was sailing out to Sydney, and he met an American girl, Virginia, who had followed her father out to Australia after he had failed in the California gold rush. He had gone out to Australia to their gold rush, and Slocum and Virginia knew each other for 2 weeks when they married. They agreed to marry. He proposed to her within days. She accepted. She was, I think, a great beauty. We don't have a lot of photographs of her, but she was a striking woman, very with enormous dignity, high cheekbones. She had some Native American origins in her. Was an outdoors woman. She was a rider, an avid rider and camper, and a crack shot. And for their honeymoon, the two of them went up to Cook Inlet soon after Alaska had been bought from the Russians, and went fishing, and had a huge shipwreck, and had to be they had to do a self-rescue. She went to sea with him and stayed at sea with him until she died at 35.
And she had her pregnancies, birthed her children on board ships.
Yes.
Schooled them.
Yes.
And did all the cooking, and she played the harp, guitar, and piano.
Yes.
She had a rather civilized life at one point when they were shuttling between San Francisco and Honolulu, and she took great pleasure, you write, in killing sharks.
She did. She loved to shoot things, and I'm going to have to confess that among the things that she liked to shoot when they were in Alaska were eagles on the wing with a rifle. So the odds were good, but that was you have to forgive them. That was then.
Oh my gosh! Now you write Benjamin fondly noted another arrow in his mother's quiver, the pleasure she took from killing sharks. To spend a few hours with sharks in mid-ocean, as he wrote, Mother and I teamed up. It was my job to get the shark interested in coming close. I used the tin can and made noise, and Mother dispatched it with her .32 caliber revolver. It's incredible.
She was a woman of many interests. One of the most astounding things I know about her is she encouraged Slocum to go up to the Okhotsk Sea up on the shore of Siberia, and 3 days after giving birth to twins, she was standing at the side at the rail of the vessel, handlining cod.
Lord, I don't know. The Hard Way Around does take readers on an extraordinary around the world journey, and we'll join the journey when we return.
You're listening to Conversations on the Coast with Jim Foster. Follow us on Twitter at Jim Foster COC, or send an email to jimfostercoc@gmail.com.
This is Conversations on the Coast. Today we are talking about a book called The Hard Way Around, The Passages of Joshua Slocum, written by Geoffrey Wolff, published by Alfred A. Knopf. And Eric Hansen says something very interesting about the book. Hugely entertaining, he starts out, and informative. In an era of teenage sailors routinely circumnavigating the world within a safety net of satellite phones, GPS navigation, emergency call beacons, and corporate sponsorship, Wolff skillfully illuminates, celebrates, and further burnishes the eccentric life and legacy of Joshua Slocum, master of tall ships, and the North Star of solo travelers. I like that phrase. The difference between then and now is almost not measurable.
Yes.
Now it's the total dependence upon technology, and then it was total dependence upon who you were. It seems to me
Self-reliance, extraordinary self-reliance.
Yeah.
But it isn't as though he didn't know that he was undertaking a very, very, very risky enterprise, which he certainly said when he set out on that. Yeah.
Very often on interviews like this, I, the interviewer, say, "Tell us how you decided to write this book," and the author kind of stumbles through that answer. But in your case, or at least in the case of this book, you tell us right out. And you're going to read where it all came from.
Absolutely. I'd be pleased to. This is from Sailing Alone Around the World. The weather was mild on the day of my departure from Gloucester. On the point ahead, as the spray stood out of the cove, was a lively picture. For the front of a tall factory was a flutter of handkerchiefs and caps. And pretty faces peered out of the windows from the top to the bottom of the building, all smiling bon voyage. Some hailed me to know where away and why alone. Why? When I made as if to stand in, 100 pairs of arms reached out and said, "Come," but the shore was dangerous. The sloop worked out of the bay against a light southwest wind, and about noon squared away off Eastern Point, receiving at the same time a hearty salute, the last of many kindnesses to her at Gloucester. The wind freshened off the point, and skipping along smoothly, the spray was soon off Thatcher Island lights, thence shaping her course east by compass to go north of Cash's Ledge and the Amen Rocks. I sat and considered the matter all over again, and asked myself once more whether it were best to sail beyond the ledge and rocks at all. It is thrilling to stumble across a chunk of gold lying in your path, even if you'd gone seeking something like it, or finding what's wonderfully termed a passage in a piece of music or movie you get to impose on a captive audience at Thanksgiving, say, or on your own birthday. In hindsight, I can't pretend to have been surprised to find gold in those Slocum Hills, but when I came upon the passage quoted above and what followed it, I was stunned, and it's simple joy to get to share it. Having meant to read a sea adventure, hoping it would have the Yankee virtues, sly wit, stoicism, descriptive accuracy that its fans advertised, I stumbled on that run of language, bearing its load so easily and the emotional burden it discharges so cunningly. Taking my breath away, it made me feel what I can only describe as love.
Yeah, love, yeah. So you wrote this book out of love.
I did.
Out of love for those words that were in his book. And that's an extraordinarily good reason, it seems to me, and unusual as well.
It's the best reason I've ever had. I felt so much pleasure in his company, and watching his language, finding how deep it ran.
Mm-hmm.
But it's not. He wasn't. He wasn't one to spill his guts. There's an emotional reticence in it too that he holds back. But there's a sense of intimacy with the reader, which is very moving, I think.
Yeah, but what was going on between him and his wife, between him and his family, that was always held.
Yes.
It seems to me.
He never discussed, in Sailing Alone Around the World, he never mentions the name Virginia, his first wife who died. But he does say, when he's anchored on his circumnavigation in the Rio Plata, where she was buried in Buenos Aires, that he gave way to his emotions, but he doesn't tell us why.
Sly fellow.
Sly, very sly fellow.
Very, very sly fellow. It's not a sly book. It's a very open book. It's one with great sincerity, with great historical accuracy, and besides those virtues, it's one hell of a read. It's called The Hard Way Around, The Passages of Joshua Slocum. The author is Geoffrey Wolff. This has been Conversations on the Coast, and I'm Jim Foster.
Follow us on Twitter at Jim Foster COC, or send an email to jimfostercoc@gmail.com.